Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all. I'm just wanting to get a different kind of view here, if I can. No, apparently not. So I'm holding up one, that's better. I'm holding up one of the books that I'm going to be working from, Picture Pedagogy, Visual Culture Concepts to Enhance the Curriculum. Part of this book, or two chapters of this book, deal with popular pleasures and the problems with those pleasures. When I come to that, I'm going to revert to this book, Popular Pleasures, an introduction to the aesthetics of popular visual culture, because this book is a great expansion on the two chapters in the earlier book. So the first thing I guess that we need to do is to say something about what visual culture is, or the way that I'm framing it, at least. This is not about art. Art is a very tiny, almost minuscule, in terms of numbers, of the images that are produced in the world today. It's not to say that they're unimportant. They do have their own importance, which I could talk about perhaps later. But this is not about art. This is about images or pictures. So the first concept is representation. And I want to talk about representation in 5 different ways. We're all familiar in art education with the formalist visual elements of line, color, tone, texture, and shape, and so on, and how they're organized. And they are very useful when talking about non-representational imagery or abstract imagery. They were designed for that kind of imagery. But they're completely inadequate when we're dealing with realistic style imagery. That is imagery, say, from Giotto through to the end of the 19th century, and of course with photographic imagery. And the dominant style of imagery that we as adults and our children are looking at all the time is photographic realism. And line, color, tone, texture, and shape just doesn't cut it as adequate concepts. What I'm about to say will be of no, it will not surprise anybody in media education or people dealing with photography, but it does seem to be absent in art education. So the first thing that we need to look at is framing. I'm at the moment in a head and shoulders shot. It's a fairly loose shot. You can see sort of things at the background. I could come closer, obviously, and I could shock you with an extreme close-up. I'm not going to do that for your sake. Framing positions the viewer in relationship to the subject of the image in terms of distance, and then combined with angles of view, upper, lower, or neutral, those two things together position the viewer in relation to the subject in space. And even the slightest change of an angle of view or the slightest change of framing can significantly determine what any viewer can in fact interpret. The image is, as I'll say later, partly determining of the meaning that can be elicited from any image. There are, of course, many other elements, lighting, for example, where people are looking at, what people are looking at, their own gaze, their facial expression, their general body language, whether there is body contact, how in other words, are they choreographed, how their bodies are choreographed. When we're looking at moving images, we need to be thinking about, is it a pan? Is it a still shot? Is the camera handheld? Why would somebody now use a handheld rather than a Steadicam? Today we're constantly dealing with drone shots, overhead shots. What about the transitions? Why are many cuts just straight cuts? Why do we have fade in and fade outs? What about parallel editing and so on? And also the very important distinction in movies between an objective point of view of the camera and a subjective point of view. That is the view that the camera takes of a particular individual in the story. And then having dealt with that language, that really basic language of imagery, which I think should be introduced at the elementary level because it doesn't require criticality. It's just basic language. Then I want to talk about what is represented. And we can do this through the different genres of painting, of television programs, of movies, the different genre of video games. They all are produced according to certain conventions. What are those conventions? How have they come about? And also, of course, stereotypes. And many stereotypes are quite benign. Some of them are not. So that is an area where criticality is required. And then what is not represented is sometimes just as important as what is represented. This is a basic assumption of Derrida's deconstructionism, that it's often the elephant in the room, the thing that nobody's picturing in this case, that's important. And here we have to deal with political erasure, legislative erasure, and also just social sensitivities. For example, why are there virtually no images on American television of the impact of American military on civilians in other countries? The rest of the world gets those images, the United States tends not to. Why is that the case? And then there are idealized imagery. And in the book, I've got a lovely example, which I suspect you're all familiar with, the classic or the iconic image of Washington crossing the Delaware. I'm told from people who've looked at this image that it's absolutely impossible. If Washington had stood as he does on that boat, he would have capsized it. And he's surrounded by different representatives of America at that time, just in the way that Mao and the current president of China tends to be pictured surrounded by the different ethnicities of China. It's not exactly a fake image, I would say, but it is a highly idealized image because it's an image of, it's part of the origin story of the United States. And every country has an origin story, and origin stories are about heritage. They're not about history. Heritage is history idealized so that present citizens can feel good about themselves. But then idealization can shift over to what is basically fakery. There's a lovely example of a 1913 painting of the first Thanksgiving, where the white settlers in America are feeding the Indians who are sitting on the ground as if they were children. I would say this is fake. This just never happened like this. So we need to look at pictures sometimes in terms of, did this ever happen? The people represented, are they anything like what they might have been? And with fake photography now, and particularly with deep fake photography, calling out these sort of images has become, I think, one of the most important things you can do as a visual culture art educator. I know this is a long way from celebrating Picasso, but this is what's happening right now. The second concept I want to talk about is rhetoric. Rhetoric has had a pretty bad reputation in the visual arts for a very long time. I want to talk about rhetoric because pictures are rhetorical devices. They're sites of ideological struggle, a catchphrase from cultural studies. They're at the crosshairs of debates about issues. What are the elements of rhetoric? What makes rhetoric work? And we can see then how this applies to pictures. First of all, the authority or the credibility of the source. Now, once upon a time, certain things had great authority. the Bible for many people had great authority, still does for some, or God. But when we're looking at a market-based society, where we're looking at images that are coming from global corporations, where we know that money is involved, there's, we're not so confident about credibility. But we nevertheless try to hang on to things like, is this actor a good actor? Have they won Academy Awards? Well, that has a stamp of approval, so we'll watch this movie, for example. And photography, despite the undermining of the evidential truth of photography through digitalization, for most people, most of the time, I think, photography still retains great authority, because certainly with old film photography, what is captured in a photograph is proof that at one point, what is in the photograph existed in a way that a painting or a drawing does not. It does not have what Ronald Barthes calls the lustral bath of innocence, the evidential truth of photography. Then there is emotion, and what Aristotle calls the eloquence of the delivery. If you combine emotion with what he calls the eloquence of the delivery, this sensory qualities, then what you're talking about is aesthetics, because aesthetics is basically emotion and sensation. And that's true whether you're talking about modernist aesthetics or whether you're talking about postmodern aesthetics. I'll try and make that distinction later if I get time. And then every movie or TV program, in offering an argument, it has to be relatively consistent. It may start from completely false assumptions, but it has to build on those assumptions in some kind of logical way. Emotion is absolutely critical. As Aristotle said 2.5 millennia ago, if you don't understand what is driving, what emotion is driving the concerns of your audience, you've got no chance ever of persuading them to another point of view. This is why Trump is so successful with his followers, because his own outrage, his own sense of victimization, which seems to be very deep, very much part of him, finds absolute equivalence in his followers. He's extraordinarily good at exploiting that. Aristotle says the only difference between rhetoric as it is normally thought of and the arts, and he was thinking particularly about drama, and that's fine. It's not on stage anymore, it's on screen, but it's the same thing. The only thing that's different is that with rhetoric, the arguments are made directly. You tell the audience what they should be thinking. So advertisements tell you what you should be buying, why you should justify your buying, they tell you. Whereas television programs or dramas, comedies, whatever, show you. It's the classic distinction between telling and showing. And showing in many ways is far more persuasive, because through the actors and the mise-en-scene, the values, the ideas, the values, the beliefs come through as just common sense assumptions about the way the world is. You're not told, they're just assumed. So it's much easier to be convinced, particularly if those values and beliefs are repeated over and over and over again, from program to movie to magazine and so on, where there's a sort of a loop, a self-referential loop. There are many ideologies. Start to look at the TV programs in terms of patriarchy versus gender equity, for example. These are ideologies. They're not truths well, I would argue. You may think of gender equity as absolutely true, and it seems absolutely true to us at the moment. But historically, it hasn't been true. It's only in very recent decades that people have begun to think about it in a serious way. And it's still not true for many, many cultures across the world. So it's something that has to be argued for. The same is true of ideologies about war, about religion, about the environment. It seems absolutely true to us now that we need to save the planet, but there are people who are arguing against it. And of course, there are numerous ideologies about education. All theories about education deal with ideologies about human nature and about learning, and of course about society by extension, and even ideologies about government. Now, one of the things that rhetoric is the concept of rhetoric is particularly useful for is looking at popular visual culture today and linking it to much of pre-modern fine art. So pretty much everything up until the modernist period. And I'm thinking of the modernist period beginning with Immanuel Kant in terms of philosophy, which then was so influential on the Romantic movement, beginning of the 19th century, and then through to the avant-garde that really starts to pick up steam in the 1850s, 1860s, and then, of course, from a modernist perspective, just takes over the art world, overlooking the fact that the academic art, the art of the status quo, continued on. Because both they can be linked, because both were produced not from the perspective of the artist expressing him or herself, but whatever pleased a patron, whether that patron was a member of the aristocracy, whether it was the church, and in the 19th century, whether it was the market. Basically, what happened with the avant-garde is they gave away two of the major functions that the visual arts had always had. One was narrative or storytelling. That was taken over later, of course, with movies in particular. And they gave away realistic representation. Both of those things were picked up by popular culture and are major characteristics of popular culture today. You can think in very broad terms of popular culture today and pre-modern fine art in terms of a rhetoric of emotion. Whereas the modernist period, you can think of that in terms of an aesthetic of emotion, where artists were expressing themselves rather than what they thought their patron would approve of. And they did that largely through sensory means, the abstraction and non-representational work. The other major way to link popular visual culture today and the history of pre-modern fine art is through semiotics. I'll get onto that in a little while. So now I'm running out of time. So I'm going to move quickly to gazing, the concept of the gaze. Today, we tend not to gaze that much in the ordinary language sense of a prolonged examination. We tend to glance. We're a glance culture. Even in art galleries, it's said that people only look at an artwork that may have been designed to be looked at for 20 minutes and repeatedly looked at. We just glance at and then we move on to the next image. We're a culture that just scrolls all the time. And the images that we look at most of the time are moving anyway and highly ephemeral. In this book, Picture Pedagogy, I talk about a picture, people, place dynamic the three things: the picture itself, who we are as viewers, and where we view, the place in which we view, as determining of meaning. So that meaning can be seen as a symbiotic process between each of these three things. I talked before about how pictures determine a range of meaning, outside of which, it just doesn't. You cannot turn a picture of a cat into a picture of a dog. If we did that, you would think we would be thinking you would be crazy. Very simple example. When we look at a picture, we are bringing who we are to a very large extent, because in Western history, there's been an equation, and there still very much is an equation between looking and our personal identity. Our way of thinking is the way we look. So we bring to our looking who we are, whether it's in terms of age or gender or class, educational background, and so on. And then there is place. And we can think about place again in three ways. There's institutional spaces, there are social spaces, and environmental spaces. So let's look briefly at institutional spaces. In a hospital, doctors and nurses are always dealing with a binary. Is this person healthy? Is this person sick? In a crime context, police are thinking guilty, not guilty. Teachers in a classroom, particularly an elementary or a high school, have a couple of binaries. It's, do these children need help, or are they fine by themselves? Or are these children behaving well, or are they about not to? And teachers, of course, like to suggest to their classroom that they have eyes in the back of their head, so that their children are constantly under surveillance. And then there are social factors. So most people tend not to watch horror movies by themselves. They tend to watch them with other people. And so they can share the sense of shock and horror and dread. It can become quite participatory. So people are shouting back at the television screen. You can't do this in a movie. It's one of the advantages of watching videos in your lounge room. Men tend to shout at the television screen with other men when watching TV wrestling. It's very gendered. Of course, there are exceptions, but it's largely a gendered form. And women tend to watch daytime soap operas. Again, it's quite gendered. On the phone with perhaps somebody else who's watching at the same time, going backwards and forwards, commenting on the action. And then there are environmental factors. So if you're driving along a freeway and you see a billboard, you can only glance. But if you're looking at the same billboard in a library, a book inside the library, you can in fact look at it quite differently. You're not looking at it in an ecologically sound way, because the ecologically sound way is to be driving along the freeway, but nevertheless. When you're looking at the same image in a classroom, teachers are hoping that you're looking at it, or students are looking at it with a curious gaze and are taking it in more than is able when you're just glancing. So again, not an ecologically sound way of doing it, but nevertheless necessary for analysis. So what I'm wanting to suggest is that each of these things, who you are, the limitations that are imposed by the image, and the limitations and the affordances, of course, of the environment, are each symbiotically determining of meaning. Meaning does not reside in the picture. Think about photographs. Photographs, as I mentioned before, have this lustral bath of innocence about they evidentially true, but they do not provide context. This is why, and I forgot to mention, anchorage as one of the elements of representational imagery. Images don't by themselves mean much at all. They need to be anchored. They are anchored often by captions, even in art galleries. You look at an image and you go up and you look at, oh, the artist, it's that particular artist, they lived from such and such date to such and such date, and it's called this. Okay, well, that helps me to understand the picture. Newspaper photographs are always contextualized with words. Movies are contextualized with music, with words, of course, dialogue, sometimes spoken dialogue over the picture, and of course, with other pictures. Other pictures are constantly informing you as to how to interpret other pictures. Pictures become a form of pedagogy for other pictures. When we are talking about just individuals looking at pictures, we normally use the term gaze. When we're thinking about a whole society or a whole era, the language is usually scopic regime. This is not something I deal with in the book, but I'm dealing with it at the moment. And as I said before, we have a kind of glance or a fragmented way of looking at imagery. Martin Jay says that in terms of the images we're looking at Renaissance kind of images, highly realistic imagery. But in terms of our actual way of looking, it's more Baroque, because the Baroque celebrates movement, dynamism, no fixed viewpoint. There are many pleasures of the gaze. There is, of course, scopophilia. Scopophilia means a love of looking. But if we're looking at pictures, it's not just that. There's a certain voyeuristic aspect to any looking, because whoever is in the picture cannot answer us back. All right, we are in a position of power to the object that we're looking at. We turn the subject into an object in a sense. Much of our looking at action movies is about sadism. We rejoice when the villain is brought down. We love it, And we can. I mentioned before that we bring our identities to images, but we can always transgress. We can always adopt a different position. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to adolescents who are trying to work out what their identities are, particularly often in terms of their sexual orientation. They may try on alternative sexualities in order to eventually work out where they're at. But we can always transgress. In playing on certain sites, people adopt avatars that are quite different from who they actually are. And this has been known for a long time. Okay, time's running out very quickly. So intertextuality, very, very quickly. A text is taken over from semiotics, where a picture is a text, something written is a text, song lyrics are a text, a piece of musical notation is a text. And no text is an isolated thing. It's always references the past, and it frequently references the present. In art history, what we have tended to do, certainly during the modernist period, was to only look at pictures in terms of a succession of styles. Gombrich's famous The Story of Art is just a history of one style emerging from another. But art historians, starting in the 70s, but getting really picking up steam in the 80s, started to look not just diachronically, but synchronically across the culture at the time to see, for example, with Dutch 16th century imagery, the sort of thing that Rembrandt and Frans Hals were doing. They were doing it not just as a result of what had been done before, but what was being done within their own society, with microscopes, with telescopes, with mapping, with the way in which preachers were using metaphors in the pulpit, and so on. And in this book, I talk about Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the rhizome. And this was introduced, to my knowledge, by Marjorie Wilson and Brent Wilson back in the 90s at Penn State. I suspect Chris is familiar with this. And it's very useful to think of visual culture in terms of having a rhizomatic structure. What is a rhizomatic structure? Well, first of all, it's not like a tree. A tree is planted, it's a single thing. Grass is a rhizome. Grass develops laterally. It's very hard to kill a lot of grass because it'll just pop up somewhere else. The internet is a rhizome. And I go in some detail as to why it is a rhizome. Our brains, or at least the way in which our brains work, is rhizomatic because we think in terms of association. And any image maker is thinking in terms of association. What is he or she drawing upon? It's diachronic and it's synchronic. But then as viewers, we are making our own rhizomatic associations. We look at a picture of a cat, for example, and plenty of them on the internet, and we're making our own associations from one association to another association to another association. And I argue that the rhizome can be used as a structure for curriculum development, as opposed to the tree-like curriculum. I'm running out of time. So what I'm going to do is skip to talking about the pleasures of popular visual culture. The pleasures of popular visual culture, I argue, of today's popular visual culture have been perennial. They tell us something about at least the Western human tradition. And I'll just run through the ones that are in this book. So a realistic style hasn't always dominated Western culture, but it has for a very long time. There's the illusionistic, what I've called the bright and the busy, as opposed to the doctrine of decorum, by which class distinctions have often been made. The highly emotional. For many modernists, it was fine to be highly emotional, but not overly emotional. There's, in particular, sentimental. Sentimental comes in for a great deal of castigation. The vulgar, the violent, the horrific, the miraculous, the exotic, the erotic, the spectacular, the narrative, the formulaic, and the humorous. Now, in each case in this book, what I do is to provide, in each chapter, I provide an example and then a description, including the psychological impact and the physiological changes that can take place. And then I look at the historical critical discourse of each of these. Some of them go back to Plato and have dominated discourse throughout Western history or Western philosophy. And then I question, why are these things popular? Why is violence? Why are we drawn to it? Why are we drawn to horror? Some of these pleasures might seem obvious, but others are not quite so obvious. And I'm not wanting to condemn people for being attracted. I think there are some really good psychological and socio-political reasons why people are attracted, and we should acknowledge their pleasure. We should not condemn it out of hand, as art educators have tended to do. But then I talk also about the problems involved. I don't attack any of these pleasures in and of themselves, but almost all of them have been used for political agendas that are not always benign. If you are, for example, with vulgarity, if you are condemning your enemies as disgusting, as abject, then you are truly othering people in a way that perhaps raises lots of moral questions. How long have I got to go, Chris, by myself?
Another 5 minutes or so. If you need a little time, it's not a problem.
Okay. So coming back to trying to make some of this practical, coming back to this book, there's a chapter in here where I explore what I've called the visual culture appraisal compass, where I ask a whole bunch of questions. What questions? How questions? Where, when, why, and how questions? And then picking up on the notion of intertextuality, questions about connection, and then questions about evaluation. I talk about evaluation in two different ways: drawing upon essentialist theories of art, imitation theory, for example, expression theory, therapy theory, symbolization theory, revelation theory. They've all been advanced in the last couple of 100 years as the essential defining characteristic of art. None of them work as theories of art, but none of them. So I can talk about that later. But they are very useful in creating evaluations of particular kinds of imagery. And then I go on to talk about the different pleasures of popular visual culture and of art, and the moral issues that are raised by each of them. In this book, I also talk about or give examples of a rhizomatic curriculum, and an exercise that I used with my undergraduates, which was the movie in minutes genre on YouTube. If we're going to educate students to deal with the imagery they mostly see today, it has to be realistic imagery that we're talking about, and a large proportion of it has to be in movie form. One of the basic tenets of a modernist art education going back some years, which underlay DBAE, and certainly comes from Eisner, is that if you're wanting to study images, you really need to be making them in order to understand how they're constructed. You can't just look at them. So if you start to make movies, and after all, children to some extent have migrated from spontaneous or unsolicited drawing to unsolicited movie making because they now have the equipment to do so. Of course, 20 or 30 years ago, they did not, but now they just do it on their phones. So the movie in minutes genre is collapsing a whole Hollywood production to about 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes. When I first looked at it, it seemed as though children were able to actually develop a narrative. But when you look at the images more closely, it's the movies they make more closely, they're really just iconic scenes. But nevertheless, they're a challenge to overcome many of the Hollywood special effects So it presents them with creative challenges, and it also introduces them to filming and editing processes, which they could not learn any other way. Maybe there I'll stop and just take questions, perhaps.